Hey everybody, this is the fourth year, and in this video, I will be introducing you to the phaser effect. Phasers are very similar to flangers, so much of what I said about flangers goes for phasers as well. So they're not strictly intended for creating a stereo width for your sound. They have a distinct sound that is similar to a flanger, and I usually prefer to use them in the sound design stage. So the phaser effect is created in a similar way to the flanger effect, but rather than delaying and modulating the delay time of the entire signal, the phaser basically does this to specific frequency ranges. And so it's basically changing and modulating the phases of different frequencies in your sound. And so you can see this without the modulation. It changes how that saw wave looks because it's changing different phases of different frequencies. But it doesn't really change the sound. And so when you play this filtered signal with the original signal, certain frequencies will be cancelled out and cause your phasing effect. To display how the different parameters of a phaser might work, I'm again going to look at the fruity phaser. And so while most of this will translate to any phaser, you may have different options or less options or more options, and if that is the case, it would be worth checking in the manual to make sure that you know exactly how whatever phaser you use works. So the parameters on a phaser are pretty similar to those on a flanger. You have your minimum depth, which would be similar to the original delay on a flanger, and then you have your maximum depth, which would be similar to just the depth parameter on a flanger. And then you can modulate between those two values by using an LFO, and the speed of that LFO is decided by the sweep frequency. So you can hear there's this movement in the sound now, and the higher the sweep frequency, the faster it will go. And then the lower the sweep frequency, the slower it will go. And you can increase the range of that frequency by changing the frequency range from small to large. And doing that will just allow you to get a much faster sweep frequency for the phaser. And so looking back at the minimum and maximum depth real quick, you can see that if I set larger values, the sound will be changed more. And then setting the differences between the minimum and the max to be less will create a much more subtle effect. And then the stereo parameter adjusts the LFO phase relationship between the left and the right channel. So you can see right now with the stereo set at 0.0 phase, the movements of the left and the right channel match each other. But if I start to change that stereo parameter, you'll see that they will start to be offset. And that creates a stereo width to the sound. And if I put that stereo parameter all the way up, you can see that the phase is inverted because they make opposite movements. Now, if I turn off that movement, you can hear a little bit better of how the sound is affected by the phaser. you can hear there's some kind of filtering going on. And that filtering can be changed by adjusting the number of stages. And what that will do is essentially change the number of those different kind of phase cancellations you hear. And kind of, if you think of it as a comb filter, it will change the number of teeth on that comb. Now, the feedback parameter works the same way as it does on the flanger, and it just feeds some of that wet signal back through the input. And using the feedback can get you a really whistly sound and kind of really enhance the tone of the different resonances caused by that comb filtering. So with less feedback, it's less pronounced, and with more feedback, that resonance is more pronounced. And then the dry-wet parameter just changes how much of the dry signal is played versus the wet signal. So if you set it to 0% wet, it will just be the original sound. If you set it to 100% wet, it will just be the affected sound. And anywhere between these values will be some mix between the dry and the wet signal based on the percentage that you set it to. And finally, you have the out gain parameter, which just changes the level of the output. And that's because you could hear when I set the feedback pretty high, the sound got a little bit quiet. And so that allows you to boost it. The sound can also get really loud sometimes, which will allow you to reduce that. And so that really just changes the output level of the sound. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of how a phaser works. And hopefully you will now be able to use it in your production and kind of know what you're doing. In terms of what you hear, it will take some playing around, checking out presets, and deciding what sounds you like and what sounds you don't like. But you can create some pretty subtle effects, some nice subtle stereo enhancing effects, or you can just make some pretty crazy sounds using a phaser.